A grim scene unfolds under the canopy of twisted trees. The air hangs heavy with the acrid scent of acid and decay, the faint wisps of mist curling over the forest floor like searching fingers. A small group of villagers stands in a tense semicircle around two bodies. Their forms are mangled, half dissolved by the vile breath of a green dragon. The sickly greenish hue of the wounds seeps into the surrounding grass, a grotesque testament to the creature's corrosive power. The paladin strides into the clearing, his presence cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. His armor gleams faintly, even in the muted light, the sigil of Lathander etched into his breastplate, catching the dim rays. His hand instinctively rests on the hilt of his blade, the weapon a symbol of both comfort and judgment. An older man, his face etched with desperation and sorrow, steps forward, holding out a small pouch of coins. "We heard you were nearby, sir. The dragon, it's killing us. Please, you must help us. This is all we could gather." The paladin accepts the pouch without a word, the weight of the coins dropping into his palm like a silent contract. He meets the man's pleading eyes with a steady, stern gaze, then turns his attention to a young man standing near the back of the group. The boy's face is pale, his wide eyes betraying the terror that grips him. "You," the paladin says, his voice firm yet measured. "What did you see?" The boy stammers, his words spilling out in a rush. It was massive, green scales like armor. Its eyes, they burned with hate. It moved through the forest like it owned it, and its breath." He chokes on the memory, his hands trembling as he gestures vaguely toward the bodies. The paladin nods, absorbing the information. "You've done well to survive. Now go home. Stay safe. This is no place for the untrained." His tone leaves no room for argument, and the boy nods quickly, retreating into the cluster of villagers. Turning away from the scene, the paladin steps toward the edge of the clearing. Kneeling, he removes his gauntlets and folds his hands in prayer. His voice is low, almost a whisper, as he addresses his divine patron. "Morning Lord, light my path. Grant me the strength to carry out your will and protect those who cannot protect themselves." As his words fade into the stillness, a warm, golden light envelops him. His vision blurs and shifts, and for a moment, he is elsewhere. He stands before the gates of Mount Celestia, their towering form radiating an ethereal glow. The air is serene, filled with a profound peace that settles into his very soul. A soft, melodious voice resonates in his mind. "You have walked this path for 20 years, my faithful servant," the voice of the Morning Lord speaks. "Your trials are many, and the road ahead is steep, but your purpose remains true. Protect the light, shield the innocent, and know that you do not walk alone." The vision fades, and the paladin is back in the clearing. The golden light dissipates, leaving him with a renewed sense of purpose. Rising to his feet, he places his gauntlets back on, his resolve as unyielding as the steel he wears. Without a glance back, he begins his journey west, toward the Star Mounts, where the dragon awaits. The forest swallows his figure, but the light of his faith burns brightly within him, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. Bound by his oath to Lathander, the Morning Lord, Aelric was no stranger to peril. He now hunted a foe whose malice poisoned the land itself. The forest was dense, its ancient trees standing like silent sentinels. The air was heavy with the scent of moss and damp earth. Shadows stretched unnaturally long as the sun dipped below the horizon. The usual signs of life, deer grazing in the underbrush or rabbits darting across the path, were absent. In their place, an oppressive stillness reigned. Aelric could feel the weight of unseen eyes pressing against him. Even the birds, their black forms silhouetted against the grey sky, seemed to radiate malice. Crows perched on gnarled branches, their beady eyes fixed on him as if judging his every step. Aelric, a seasoned tracker, knelt beside a patch of disturbed earth. His fingers traced a claw mark etched deep into the soil. The mark was fresh, and the faint, acrid scent of poison lingered in the air. He whispered a prayer under his breath, his voice resolute but tinged with unease. Extending a hand, he invoked the divine magic of his oath. A soft golden glow emanated from his palm as the locate creature spell took hold, a faint trail of light forming in the air before him. He rose, his boots crunching against fallen leaves as he followed the trail deeper into the oppressive shadows. Every step seemed heavier than the last, the forest's oppressive atmosphere bearing down on him. The divine glow pointed him forward, guiding him through the twisted maze of trees. The trail led him to a clearing where the dragon waited, coiled atop a rocky outcrop. Its emerald scales shimmered with a sickly sheen, and its eyes gleamed with cruel intelligence. The paladin halted, gripping his sword tightly. The dragon's presence exuded an aura of corruption, the air around it thick with the stench of decay. The dragon struck first, unleashing a cloud of noxious green gas. Aelric raised his shield just in time, the poison hissing as it met the enchanted metal. The gas lingered in the air, turning leaves brown and wilting nearby plants. With a divine bravery, he charged through the toxic cloud, his sword glowing with holy light. The dragon roared its voice, a guttural mix of rage and disdain, as the blade bit into its flank. The battle was brutal and unrelenting. The dragon's claws carved deep gouges into the ground, narrowly missing the paladin as he countered with precise, radiant strikes. Its tail lashed out, sending him crashing into a tree. Bark splintered under the impact, and Aelric's breath escaped in a pained gasp. But he rose, battered yet undeterred. Blood dripped from his cracked lip as he whispered another prayer, his faith a beacon against the encroaching darkness. Every strike of the dragon's claws was met with divine retribution. The paladin's blade burned with holy fire, searing through the creature's tough hide. The dragon roared in pain, its movements growing desperate. It lunged, its venomous fangs bared. But Aelric sidestepped, driving his blade deep into its chest. Radiant light exploded outward, engulfing the beast in a blinding flash. The dragon collapsed with a thunderous crash, its lifeblood pooling around its broken form. With one final devastating blow, the paladin felled the creature. Its death was not a triumph, but a grim necessity. Kneeling beside the corpse, he whispered a prayer, not for the dragon, but for the lives it had claimed. Seacumber was a place of quiet rivers and rolling hills, perched atop 3 stone hills, overlooking the Unicorn Run and River de Limbir. It was a town of simplicity and peace, where the laughter of children echoed through cobblestone streets and the scent of fresh bread wafted from open windows. For years, it had been Aelric's sanctuary. But as he approached his modest hovel on the outskirts of town, a sense of foreboding gripped him. The small, crooked door of his home was slightly ajar, the lock hung askew, its mechanism forced open. Aelric dismounted, his armor clinking softly in the quiet evening. He drew his sword, its edge catching the last rays of sunlight as the orange glow of dusk bathed the town in an ethereal light. The shadows stretched long and dark as he pushed the door open, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, the room was eerily silent. Furniture lay overturned, and the faint metallic scent of blood lingered in the air. His breath caught as his eyes fell on her. His wife lay face down on the cold wooden floor, a dagger buried in her back. Blood pooled beneath her, dark and congealed. The world seemed to stop. Aelric dropped to his knees, his sword clattering to the ground as he cradled her lifeless body. His hands trembled as he brushed a strand of hair from her face, his tears falling freely onto her still form. His mind screamed in anguish, a tidal wave of grief threatening to drown him. For what felt like an eternity, he knelt there, the weight of his failure crushing him. But beneath the sorrow, a fire began to burn. Grief gave way to anger, and anger to cold determination. He gently laid her down and rose, his fists clenched. Searching the house, he found signs of a struggle. Furniture was upended, and the coin stash he kept hidden beneath the floorboards was empty. As he pried open the loose planks, his fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. He pulled it free, a small pin engraved with the symbol of a wayward shadow. Recognition dawned on him like a curse. He had encountered this mark before, the calling card of the Lady of Shadows Syndicate. Memories of a past skirmish in Loudwater flooded back, each one sharpening his resolve. Clutching the pin, Elric whispered a vow to Lathander. Justice would be served. Mounting his horse, he rode into the night, the glow of Seacumber fading behind him as the shadows ahead loomed ever darker. The road to Loudwater was long and fraught with uncertainty. His horse trotted steadily through the night, its hooves striking the dirt path in a rhythmic cadence. The landscape grew wilder as he approached the town, with jagged hills and gnarled trees casting eerie silhouettes under the pale moonlight. The memory of his wife's lifeless form fueled his journey, every step bringing him closer to the heart of the criminal syndicate that had torn his life apart. Loudwater was no stranger to shadowy dealings. The town's beautiful lit taverns were a facade for illicit activity. As Elric entered the outskirts, he could feel the weight of eyes watching from the shadows. The buildings, although of beautiful elven ancestry, were starting to weather and crumble. Lanterns swung gently in the breeze, their flickering light barely piercing the oppressive darkness. He dismounted and approached the gates to the underground grottos, the hidden lair of the Lady of Shadows. The entrance was guarded by two men, their faces obscured by hoods. They eyed him warily, their hands resting on the hilts of their weapons. Elric stepped forward, his voice low and steady, as he spoke the password he had learned during his last encounter with the Syndicate. Little Serpent, Long Shadow. The guards exchanged a glance before stepping aside, allowing him entry. Elric descended the narrow stone steps into the grottos. The air grew colder, and the faint scent of damp stone and mildew filled his nostrils. The passage was lined with ancient carvings, their worn surfaces bearing the marks of the long-forgotten Netherese. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and the flickering torchlight cast dancing patterns on the walls. Inside the grotto, the atmosphere was stifling. The room was filled with the low hum of hushed voices and the clink of coin-exchanging hands. Elric's presence drew wary glances, but no one dared to confront him. He approached the leader of the hideout, a man with sharp features and cold eyes. A brief exchange of words revealed the information he sought. A recent delivery of stolen goods matched the description of his missing possessions. The culprits had been seen heading toward a small hovel north of Highstar Lake. Elric left the grotto with purpose, his resolve hardening with every step. The weight of his grief drove him forward, the light of Lathander guiding him through the ever-deepening darkness. Emerging from the grotto into the dimly lit streets of Loudwater, Elric's senses were on high alert. The air was thick with tension, and the faint rustle of movement above caught his attention. He glanced upward, spotting the faint silhouettes of figures crouched on the rooftops. Their intent was clear. The ambush was already in motion. Elric stepped forward, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword. The first attacker dropped from the roof, a dagger glinting in the moonlight. Elric sidestepped the strike with practiced ease, his sword flashing as it struck the man's weapon aside. Another assailant lunged from the shadows, and Elric spun, his shield raised to block the blow. The street erupted into chaos as more attackers joined the fray. The fight was fierce, Elric's movements precise and unyielding. He disarmed one attacker, his sword clattering to the ground, and struck another down with a radiant blow. Most of the assailants fled, their courage waning in the face of his relentless assault. But one remained, his eyes filled with hatred as he continued to press the attack. Aelric's rage boiled over as he disarmed the man, driving him to the ground. He stood over the attacker, his fists raining down in a blur of fury. Blood splattered across the cobblestones as Aelric's fists connected again and again, his grief and anger fueling each strike. The man's pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears as the paladin lost himself in the storm of his emotions. Finally, he stopped, his chest heaving as he stared down at his blood-soaked hands. The man beneath him was barely conscious, his face battered and unrecognizable. His rage subsided, replaced by a crushing wave of guilt and shame. He rose unsteadily, his breath ragged as he turned away from the broken figure at his feet. The weight of his actions hung heavy on his shoulders. The paladin stepped out of the dimly lit street, his boots crunching against the gravel as the last of the fleeing attackers vanished into the shadows. Blood stained his gauntlets, and the lingering heat of his rage pulsed through his veins. His breathing now ragged, and the memory of his wife, the way she looked when he found her, lifeless and cold, flooded his mind. Suddenly the world around him seems to falter. The street vanishes, swallowed by an enveloping radiance, and a profound stillness took hold. Time itself halts. "Faithful one," a voice echoes, warm and serene, yet heavy with solemnity. The paladin turns, his surroundings now a shimmering void. Before him stands a figure of radiant light, its form shifting between the grandeur of a celestial being and the comforting familiarity of Lathander. "You stand at a precipice," the Morning Lord says. "Your path is yours to walk, but the weight of your choice will ripple across the tapestry of your soul. You are torn between justice and vengeance, between light and shadow." As the Morning Lord speaks, the space shifts. The void gives way to two visions, each vivid and alive, pulling the paladin's attention. In the first, he sees himself kneeling in the ruins of the hovel near Highstar Lake. His sword lies discarded beside him. Before him, the two young men cower, trembling but alive. He offers them mercy, his voice steady yet filled with sorrow. The weight of his pain remains, but in this vision, it is tempered by the strength to forgive. He walks away, his steps heavy, but guided by the light of his faith. His heart still bearing the scar of loss, but unbroken. The second vision is darker, painted in hues of crimson and shadow. He stands over the lifeless bodies of the young men, their blood pooling at his feet. His eyes burn with fury, his blade still wet with vengeance. In this future, he is consumed by his grief, his sorrow twisting into an endless hunger for retribution. The world around him grows dim, the light of the Morning Lord distant and faint. "Forgiveness," the Morning Lord continues, "is not for the one who caused your pain. It is for you, a balm for your soul to endure the trials of this world. Yet I do not choose your path. That is the burden of mortality, the strength and curse of free will." The visions fade, and the paladin is left alone in the radiant void. His breaths come slow, deep, as he wrestles with the weight of his decision. The Morning Lord's light begins to recede, leaving him in silence. Then, the world tilts, and he is back. The dim street, the blood on his hands, the faint sounds of the distant city. Reality crashes over him. He looks down at his fists trembling and stained red. The words of the Morning Lord echo in his mind, but the pain within him grows louder. Memories flood his thoughts. Her laugh, her touch, the way her presence filled every corner of his life. He sees her as she was, kind, radiant, the embodiment of the light he swore to protect. But now, there is only emptiness. Her absence stretches endlessly, a void that no amount of faith or forgiveness could ever fill. He clenches his fists tighter, his knuckles whitening beneath the crimson streaks. He looks to the darkened sky above, the faint glimmers of stars cold and indifferent. Forgiveness, he whispers to himself, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. He knows there is no solace for him, no peace in a world without her. The sorrow, the pain, the unrelenting weight of his loss, it all swells within him, and in that moment, as his heart shatters anew, the path becomes clear. There is no choice to be made, for the darkness has already claimed him. He mounted his horse and rides toward High Star Lake. The hovel north of High Star Lake was a desolate, crumbling structure barely held together by rotting wood and rusted nails. It sat alone on the edge of a forest, the surrounding trees casting long shadows over its sagging roof. Elric approached cautiously, his sword drawn as he surveyed the area. The faint glow of a lantern flickered inside, casting moving shadows against the cracked windows. Kicking the door open, Elric entered with purpose. The room was sparsely furnished, a few broken chairs and a table strewn with scraps of food and empty bottles. To his right, a man lunged at him with a knife, but Elric's reflexes were faster. He parried the strike and disarmed the attacker with a swift motion, his blade pressed against the man's throat. Two younger men cowered in the corner, their faces pale with fear. "We only did it to feed our family," one of them pleaded, his voice trembling. "Please, sir, we beg for forgiveness." Their words cut through Elric like a dagger, but his rage burned too brightly. He struck them down, his blade swift and merciless. Their cries echoed in the small room before falling silent. The aftermath was a chilling stillness, broken only by the sound of Elric's laboured breathing. He knelt over one of the bodies, his hands trembling as tears streamed down his face. Was this justice? Or had he become the very thing he swore to destroy? A soft cry broke the silence. Elric's head snapped toward a small door at the back of the room. Pushing it open, he found a crude crib with a wailing infant inside. His heart sank, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. He sank to his knees, staring at the child as the full measure of his grief and guilt consumed him. The light of Lathander, once his guiding beacon, felt impossibly distant as he whispered a broken prayer. Into the darkness, from somewhere deep within him, he feels the last remnants of Lathander's light stir. It is faint and distant, like the final rays of a setting sun. He hears the voice of the Morning Lord one last time, its tone both sorrowful and resolute. "My faithful servant," the voice begins, now softer than it had ever been before. "You have carried my light for many years, shining brightly even in the darkest of places. But now, the pain of your loss has dimmed your heart, and your oath lies shattered." The light around him wanes further, the warmth of the divine slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. He feels the absence growing, the bond with his God unraveling. "Understand that I do not condemn you," Lathander continues, his voice filled with compassion. "You are mortal, bound by the sorrows of this world. I see the depth of your suffering, the weight of your grief, and I mourn for you. But I cannot linger. My light is for those who seek to guide and protect, for those who can rise above their pain. Your path now belongs to the shadows of your own making."